Just below the esophagus, as you pass through the cardiac sphincter, is the stomach, which roughly has a J shape. It's certainly a pouch-like or pouch-like shaped organism, not an organism, an organ. It's about 25 to 30 centimeters long. It's below the diaphragm and the upper left portion of the abdominal cavity. It has rugae that are folds for the mucosa and submucosa that allows it to be distendable, so you can stretch it. So the stomach receives food from the esophagus. There it will mix with gastric juices. These are juices produced by the stomach and accessory organs. That will initiate the protein digestion. There's a highly acidic environment, so we can start to break down the bonds that hold amino acids together. It has a limited amount of absorption. There are a couple of things that do get absorbed through the stomach lining. Alcohol happens to be one of them, ethanol, and aspirin is another one, but most things are not absorbed in the stomach. The food from the stomach would make its way to the small intestines. It has an inner circular layer of muscle, an outer longitudinal layer of muscle, and some parts of it have oblique fibers. So those circular, longitudinal, and oblique fibers are important for the way the stomach kind of churns food within it, bolus within it. So here are the four parts of the stomach: the cardia near the cardiac sphincter, the fundus, the little bulge at the top where some people like to store gas until they're ready to belch it out, the body, and the pylorus near the pyloric sphincter. And here is an image of a stomach. So the gastric glands contain three types of secretory cells that produce this fluid, a mixture we call gastric juice. It contains pepsinogen, which is a pre-enzyme secreted by chief cells, but in the acidic environment of the stomach, that pepsinogen will be converted, a piece will break off, be converted to pepsin. Pepsin is the active enzyme that begins to break proteins into polypeptides. It's formed when pepsinogen is broken down in the presence of hydrochloric acid. And pepsin can also convert pepsinogen to active pepsin. There is gastric lipase. Lipases are involved in breaking down fats. This one is made for the stomach, so it's gastric lipase. It's found in small quantities. It doesn't work great because the low pH of the stomach, but it's there and can begin working as soon as we get this stomach contents into the small intestines, where we're going to raise the pH. Hydrochloric acid is produced by parietal cells, which convert pepsinogen into pepsin and help break down proteins in other ways. Mucus itself is secreted by the mucus cell. That not only provides lubrication for the stomach walls, it also helps protect the stomach lining. It's a very basic mucus compared to most mucus. Something else that is produced in the stomach is called intrinsic factor. It's produced by parietal cells, and it is absolutely required for absorption of B12 from our intestinal contents. So these gastric pits appear in the lining of the stomach, and those gastric pits are lined with combinations of mucus cells, gastric glands, parietal cells, and chief cells, producing the things we just discussed, and as shown here. The gastric secretions are regulated both neurally and by hormones. It's produced constantly, but we can vary its production rate. The neural regulation, sympathetic impulses would decrease gastric activity, whereas parasympathetic impulses increase gastric activity. They promote the release of histamine, and histamine in this case will stimulate gastric secretion. Some of the hormones that are important include somatostatin, that inhibits hydrochloric acid secretion, gastrin, that increases gastric juice cholecytokinin, or CCK as I will now refer to it. is released by the small intestines when proteins and fat get into the small intestines, and that helps to increase gastric motility. And again, I won't walk you through this figure, but you should refer to figure 1720. I'm sure it will help you understand the process and help you answer the questions in your homework. We can divide the control of gastric secretions into three big phases. Cephalic phase, which cephalic refers to head, so this is mostly related to things you prepare to eat. Gastric phase, gastric refers to stomach, so this is what happens when food gets into the stomach itself. And then intestinal phase, when the food makes its way from the stomach to the intestines, or when parts of the meal make its way there. So that cephalic phase would be induced just by the sight, taste, and smell. Even the thought of food can trigger parasympathetic reflexes, and the response we would get is secretion of gastric juices in anticipation. When the food gets into the stomach and chemically and mechanically stimulates the release of gastrin, that in turn stimulates the secretion of gastric juices. I'd say reflexive responses also occur that stimulate gastric juices secretion. As some of the food begins to enter the small intestines, it will stimulate the intestinal cells to release intestinal gastrin, and that in turn briefly promotes the secretion of gastric juice from the stomach wall. That phase primarily inhibits gastric juice secretion. Absorption. So I said there wasn't many things that do absorb. The pepsin begins breaking down proteins. The walls of the stomach, though, is not well adapted for digestive products. However, as I said, alcohol, aspirin would fall under lipid-soluble drugs. Some salts and some water do get absorbed from the stomach. Food in the stomach came in as a bolus, and now it's becoming a semi-fluid paste called chyme. Peristaltic waves push that chyme towards the pylorus, the pyloric sphincter of the stomach, and a little bit is squeezed through the pyloric sphincter at a time, kind of a squirt at a time. Chyme starts to fill the duodenum. That will initiate receptors that cause the enterogastric reflex, and that slows the stomach emptying into the intestinal as the intestines get full, so we don't overload anything. So some common problems: heartburn, stomach ache results from eating a lot of food too quickly. It can take up to 20 minutes for your hypothalamus to realize that you are full. And many of us continue to eat for those 20 minutes at least. Excess fullness can lead to abdominal pain, gastric reflux, as the stomach contents make their way back into the esophagus. And it's much more acidic than the esophagus is designed to handle. That leads to esophagitis, and feels like the pain is derived from the region of the heart, so it's often called heartburn. Antacids do provide some relief. Best way to prevent it is to eat small meals slowly, stay upright after eating, and avoid some things that can affect the regulation like caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. Okay, that takes care of the stomach.